I have told this story exactly 3 times in my life, and each time my voice has gone somewhere it does not usually go, somewhere low and careful, the way a man speaks in a church he was not raised in. I am telling it now a 4th time, and a last time, because I am old, and because the boy who stood beside me that morning is a grown man himself with sons of his own, and because I have come to believe that some things ought to be set down by the people who were close enough to see them, before the people who were close enough are all gone. My name is Thomas Ward. I was a joiner for 41 years, which means I spent my life making doors hang true and stairs that did not creak and tables that would outlast the men who ate at them. It is honest work, and it teaches you a particular kind of patience, the patience of a man who knows that a thing rushed is a thing done twice. It also teaches you to see what is bearing weight and what is only resting, which is a thing most men never learn to see at all, and which turned out, on the morning I am going to tell you about, to be the most useful thing I knew. I mention all of this only so you understand the sort of person I am. I am not a man given to wonder. I do not see signs in the weather, and I have never had much patience for those who do. I had reached the age of 63 having decided, more or less, that the world was made of ordinary things done by ordinary people, and that the grand words men carve onto monuments and speak over graves are mostly there to make the ordinary feel less small than it is. Then came the founding day I am going to tell you about, and I have never been quite so sure of my own opinion since. It was a cold morning, the kind of cold that does not bite so much as lean on you, a wet gray weight that came down off the river before dawn and settled into the stones of the city and would not be argued with. There had been rain in the night and there would be rain again, and in between the sky simply hung there, low and the color of a dead fire, leaking. The kind of weather that drives sensible people indoors and leaves the streets to the young, the foolish, and the determined. We were the determined. I had brought my grandson up from the country the day before, the two of us rattling for half a day in a coach that smelled of wet wool and other people's breakfasts, and I had grumbled the whole way, about the cost, about the crowds, about the rheumatism that had got into my hip the winter before and made a misery of long sitting. I grumbled because grumbling is what a man my age does instead of saying that he is glad to be alive and glad of the company of a boy. Pip knew it for what it was. He had ridden the whole way with his nose pressed to the glass, and he let me grumble, and now and then he would say, "Yes, Grandad," in a tone that told me he had stopped listening hours ago, and we were both content. Pip was 9 that year, all knees and questions, and he had never seen the Capitol, never seen Whitmore Palace, never seen the household guard stand the review at the Standard Gate. His mother, my daughter, had asked me to take him, the way you ask a thing of someone when you have already decided they will do it, and I had done it, because that is what you do, and because a part of me, a larger part than I would have admitted at the time, wanted to see the old city again through a young pair of eyes before mine gave out entirely. We found a place along the iron railing of the King's Mile 2 full hours before the procession was due, which is the only way to get a place at all on Founding Day. The mile is the long avenue that runs straight as a plumb line from the river up to the palace forecourt, and at its head stand the great gates they call the Standard Gate, because it is there, and only there, that the old colors of the realm are carried out once a year and shown to the people they belong to. The gates are tall as 3 men and gilded at the tops and black as a kettle below, and on either side of them, set into the stone of the gatehouse, are those deep sentry boxes worn smooth and pale by 300 years of shoulders leaning where shoulders are not supposed to lean. It is there that the household guard takes its post. Pip wanted to know everything. He always did. Why were the gates so tall, and were they ever closed, and what was behind them? And why was the stone worn pale in 2 long stripes beside the boxes? And why did the men wear those great black fur hats that must have weighed as much as a sack of meal? And did they ever fall over? I answered what I could and invented the rest, the way grandfathers do, and the lies were better than the truths and we both knew it and neither of us minded. And all the while the crowd thickened around us, pressing in along the rail until we were 3 and 4 deep, a forest of dripping umbrellas and steaming breath and damp coats, the whole avenue slowly turning into one long, restless animal waiting to be fed its spectacle. There is a particular smell to a great crowd in the wet, of wool and rain and the cheap sweetness of the vendors' roasted nuts, and I smell it still sometimes when the weather turns, and I am 63 again at the rail with a boy's cold hand in mine. And there, no more than 30 feet from where we had wedged ourselves, was the guard. I want to be careful here, because so much of everything that came after turns on what he was before. He was a tall man, though not enormous, and he stood in the full dress of the household, the scarlet tunic dark with the wet, the black bearskin towering above him, the white gloves, the brass of him polished to a dull, steady fire that the gray morning could not quite put out. He held a long rifle just so against his shoulder, the bayonet fixed and catching what little light there was, and across his chest ran a row of medals, ribbons gone limp and dark in the rain. His chin strap cut a pale line across a face that might have been carved from the same stone as the gatehouse. He did not move. I do not mean that he moved little. I mean that he did not move at all, not in any way a watching man could measure. The rain ran off the slope of his hat and down the wool of his shoulders and gathered at his boots, and he stood in it as the gatepost stood in it, as if he had grown there, as if he were a part of the iron and the stone that someone had, by an oversight, made breathe. Pip stared at him for a long time the way children stare, without manners and without shame. Then he tugged my sleeve and whispered, the way children whisper, which is to say at a volume that carries to the next street, "Grandad, is he real?" A few people near us laughed, gently, and an old woman at my elbow leaned down and told Pip that yes, the guards were real men, and that her own husband had stood that very gate 40 years gone, and that the trick of it was to fix your eye on a far thing and not let it come back. Pip considered this and asked her whether her husband had ever sneezed. The old woman laughed a laugh that turned into a cough and said that what a guard did with a sneeze was between the guard and his maker, and that she had never asked. And I told the boy that standing still like that was a harder thing than it looked, harder than running, harder than fighting, that it took a particular strength to hold yourself so for hours in the cold and never once let the world see you feel it. Pip weighed this against everything a 9-year-old knows about the world and found it wanting. Standing still, he informed me, was not as good as fighting. I let him keep his opinion. I had more or less the same one, and I was more than 50 years older than he was and ought to have known better. I tell you all of this so you will understand that for the first hour and more, that guard was to me exactly what he was to nearly everyone else along the mile. He was scenery. He was a fine and dignified piece of the morning's furniture, no more alive in my reckoning than the gilding on the gate or the worn pale stone of the box. I watched him the way you watch a monument, which is to say I took him in, found him handsome and solemn, decided he made a good picture against the black iron, and then mostly forgot him, looking past him and around him for something that would actually happen. I am not proud of this, but it is the truth, and I have promised myself this last telling will be nothing but the truth, because the man at the center of it never in his life told anything else, and he deserves no less from me. I will confess one more thing, while I am confessing. I had a brother once who soldiered. He was older than me by 6 years, and he went off to one of the small wars they were always fighting on the edges of the realm when we were young, and he did not come home. And my mother kept his letters in a tin until she died, and then I kept them in the tin until the damp got at them. And I read them sometimes, on the bad nights, though I could no longer make out half the words. I say this because I think, looking back, that some part of me had decided long ago that soldiering was a thing that took good men away and gave back tins of ruined letters, and that the pomp of it, the bearskins and the brass and the standards in the rain, was a kind of paint laid over that ugly fact to make it bearable to look at. I had carried that quiet bitterness in me for 40 years. I want you to know I was carrying it that morning at the rail, while I watched the still scarlet man and found him merely decorative. It matters to what came after. It matters because of how completely it was undone. What undid it came up the mile in a long black motor car with little pennants fluttering wet on its bonnet, and it got out at the foot of the forecourt and made itself known to everyone within a quarter mile. He was a foreign general. I learned his rank and his realm and his name later, when the whole city was talking of nothing else. But I knew what he was before I knew any of it, because a certain kind of man wears his rank in his walk, carries it the way a peacock carries its tail, as a thing to be spread and admired. He had come with the delegation from Omsk, a country across the eastern sea that I will say little about because it has little to do with the heart of this, only that they were guests of the realm that week, here for the founding and for the signing of some treaty that the newspapers had been chewing over for a month. He was perhaps 50, broad through the chest and going soft below it, with a gray mustache waxed to 2 fine points, and a row of medals across his breast so dense and so bright that they chimed faintly when he moved, a small private music that announced him. He moved through the world as though the world were a thing prepared for his convenience, and he had that quality some powerful men have of seeming to draw the air toward himself, so that the rest of us felt in his presence as though we were merely renting our share of it from him. General Merk Vossler, that was the name. I will use it plainly, because a man's deeds ought to keep his name fastened to them, the good and the bad alike, and what he did on the King's Mile that morning was the second kind, and I see no reason to spare him the keeping of it. He came up with a small swarm around him, aides and attachés in dark coats and 2 younger men whose whole purpose, as far as I could see, was to carry cameras and to be ready at every instant to record the general being magnificent. And he was, in his loud and chiming way, a magnificent thing to look at, and the crowd, which had grown bored and cold and damp in its long wait, came alive at the sight of him. People pointed. People held up their own little cameras. A ripple of interest ran down the rail, the crowd glad of anything to break the gray monotony of the morning, and the general felt it, the way such men always feel it, and it fed him, and he grew an inch taller on it before our eyes. He stopped at the standard gate. He tilted his head back and looked up at the gilded tops of it and nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming that a thing has met the standard he sets for things. He said something to one of his aides about the workmanship of the ironwork, in a voice meant to be overheard, the voice of a man who wants strangers to know he is the sort who notices workmanship. And then his eye came down off the gate and fell on the guard, and I saw it happen because I was close enough to see it, and I did not like what I saw even then, before I knew anything at all. It was amusement. It was the particular amusement of a man who has walked into the middle of all this solemnity and found, against his expectation, a thing he can play with. He turned to the aide and said something low, and the aide laughed too loudly, the way aides do, a laugh that is not a laugh but a kind of salute. Then the general stepped close to the sentry box, closer than any of us at the rail would have dreamed of stepping, right up into the small private space where the guard stood his post, and he looked the man up and down with his hands clasped behind his back and his chin tilted, studying him the way you might study a horse you had already decided not to buy, looking for the flaws to justify the decision. "Marvelous," he said in our language, which he spoke well, with a heavy, careful accent that gave each word more weight than it had earned. He pitched it loud enough for the front of the crowd to hear, and I understood at once that he meant us to hear it, that we were the audience and the guard was the prop. Quite marvelous. They make them so still, like the figures one sees in a museum behind the rope where the children are told do not touch. He turned to his people, to the cameras, spreading the moment out for them like a host carving a joint. "In my country, you understand, we put our soldiers in the field. Here I see it is different. Here they take the finest of them and they polish them and they stand them at the gate to be admired. A shelf for the soldiers. Charming, truly. A charming little custom." His own people laughed warmly, the practiced warmth of men whose livelihoods depend on a great man's good humor. And a few in the crowd laughed too, a thin, nervous scatter of it, the kind that comes out before a man has decided whether the thing is actually funny or only loud. I did not laugh. The old woman at my elbow did not laugh. I heard her make a small, disgusted sound in her throat. And the guard did not laugh. The guard did not so much as turn an eye. He stood looking out over the heads of the crowd at some fixed point 1,000 miles beyond us all, exactly as he had stood for the hour and more before, the rain still running off the slope of his hat, the brass still holding its dull fire, the man as immovable as the morning he was standing in. I felt Pip go quiet beside me. Children know before grown men do when the air has changed. He had stopped fidgeting. His hand crept back into mine. The general was not satisfied. I have spent a great many of the years since turning over the question of why he was not satisfied, why a man with so much could not let one cold soldier alone, and I have come at last to believe it was the stillness itself that he could not abide. A man like Vossler measures the world entirely by the effect he has upon it. He walks into a room and the room arranges itself around him. The conversations bend toward him. The faces turn, and that arrangement is the proof, renewed minute by minute, that he matters, that he is real, that he is the largest thing present. And here was a man, a common soldier in his estimation, an ornament, a thing on a shelf, who would not arrange himself toward him at all, who gave back nothing, no fear, no flattery, no flicker of the deference the general fed on as other men feed on bread. To Vossler that was not discipline. Vossler had no eye for discipline that did not point at him. To Vossler it was a wall, and a wall is an affront to a man who has spent his life walking through rooms that opened for him, and he set himself, there at the standard gate, to find the door in it. "You," he said to the guard, and the amusement was thinning in his voice now, going hard at the edges. "You soldier, I wish to have my photograph made here at this fine gate. You are standing in the way of it. Step aside, just there." He gestured, a small flick of his ringed fingers, the gesture you make to a waiter you have not bothered to look at. The guard did not step aside. The guard, of course, could not step aside, and I understood this even then dimly, though it would be made plain to all of us before the morning was out. He was at his post. A man at his post does not move at the order of a foreign guest, does not move at the request of a great man, does not move at the asking of anyone short of those few set over him in his own line of command. This is not stubbornness, and it is not rudeness, whatever it looked like to Vossler. It is the entire meaning of the thing. A guard who steps aside because he is asked, however grand the asker, is no longer a guard. He is only a man wearing a costume at a gate, and the gate he keeps is no longer kept. But the general did not know this, or could not be troubled to know it, and the guard's silence and his stillness struck him now as plain insolence, and whatever amusement had been left in his face curdled and went out of it. "I gave you an order," he said. He had dropped his voice, but in the way a man drops his voice precisely so that the menace in it will travel further than a shout could. The front of the crowd leaned in to catch it despite itself. "Do you understand me, soldier? Are you simple? Has the cold frozen what little is in your head? I am General Vossler. When I tell a soldier to step aside, the soldier steps aside in any country, in any weather, under any flag. Now, step aside." The front of the mile had gone very still. The thin scatter of laughter had died completely and would not come again. An old instinct, older than manners, older than crowds, had begun to move through the press of bodies along the rail, the instinct that tells you a thing is going wrong before you, and that you are about to watch it whether you wish to or not. I felt my own jaw tighten until it ached, and I am ashamed to tell you that I did not call out. None of us called out. We stood at the rail, 10,000 of us, and we watched a powerful man lean down over a soldier who was not permitted to answer him, and we did the thing that crowds do, which is to say we did nothing at all, each of us waiting for someone braver to be the first, and so no one was. The guard held. I had fixed my eye on his eye because the eye is the last of a man to go, the place where the held thing finally shows itself if it is going to show at all, and the eye did not move. It stayed on its far point above us, steady, fixed, looking through the general and the gate and the gray city beyond as if none of them were there. But I will tell you the one thing I saw, or the one thing I believe I saw, and you may make of it what you will. At the corner of his jaw, just below the white line of the chin strap, a single muscle drew taut and held a moment and then eased, the way a rope sings once under a sudden load and then settles to bear it. It was nothing. A watcher less close or less practiced in the reading of strain would never have caught it, and it was the whole man. It was the only sign in his entire body that there was a furnace somewhere behind that scarlet stillness, banked and burning, and that he was choosing, second upon second, by some act of will I did not yet have the means to understand, to keep the door of it shut against everything the general could throw at it. Vossler reached out and rapped his knuckles twice against the brass of the guard's belt plate, the way a man knocks on a door to learn whether anyone is home. "Hollow," he announced to his aides, and the grin came back, ugly now. "You hear it. I think there is nothing inside. I think they have taken the man out and stood the shell up to be looked at. A coat, a hat, a fine red coat over nothing." His people laughed again, and the cameras came up, and one of the young men edged sideways to get the general and the unmoving guard both in his frame. And then, because the audience was his, and the morning was his, and the whole of the King's Mile had become in his mind a stage built for his pleasure, the general did the thing I have never in all the years since been able to put out of my mind. He reached up and he knocked the man's bearskin. I want to be fair, even to Vossler, because a true telling is fair even to the men in it who deserve no fairness, and so I will say plainly that it was not a blow. It was a flick of the back of his hand against the front of the great black hat, a contemptuous little tap, the kind of thing a man does to a child's spinning top to set it wobbling, to prove to himself and to his audience that the thing is only a thing. But the bearskin is not a hat the way a hat is a hat. I know that now. I did not know it fully then, but the crowd knew it, the way a crowd knows things in its body before its mind has the words, and I felt the knowledge go through the people along the rail like a current through water. The bearskin is the regiment. It is 300 years of men who stood that gate in every weather and every danger and never moved. To strike it, even lightly, even as a jest, in front of a foreign delegation and 10,000 of the realm's own people, was a thing so far past the bounds of what may be done, that the old woman beside me drew in her breath as sharply as if the hand had struck her own face. The hat shifted, an inch no more, the chin strap caught it and held it from going further, and the guard did not move. I cannot make you feel what it was to watch that, but I owe it to him to try. Every part of me, every nerve and instinct of more than 40 years of being a man among men, was on its feet and roaring that he should turn, that he should knock that smug ringed hand aside, that he should put the brass-shod butt of that rifle into the general's soft belly and fold him over the railing and let the cameras have that he should do something, anything, to answer the thing that had just been done to him in front of the world. That is what I would have done. I am not a violent man. I have raised my hand to no one since I was a boy, and I tell you that standing at that rail I wanted, with a wanting that frightened me, to see that general struck down. That is what 9 men in 10 would have done in the guard's place, and been cheered for it, and rightly. And the longer he did not do it, the more terrible and the more astonishing his stillness became, until it stopped being the stillness of a statue altogether and turned into something else, something I had spent my whole working life looking at without ever once seeing it for what it was. I told you I was a joiner, and that the trade teaches a man to see what is bearing weight and what is only resting. A beam at rest and a beam under load look, to an untrained eye, exactly alike. They are the same wood, the same length, the same color, but to a man who has spent his life among them, they are as different as a sleeping man and a man holding his breath under water. The one is simply there. The other is doing something every instant with everything it has, a labor that does not move and makes no sound and would kill it to stop. I had taken that guard all morning for a beam at rest, a handsome ornamental post, holding up nothing, there to be looked at. And I saw now, with the part of me that had spent 41 years among loaded timber, that I had been a fool. He was bearing the whole weight of the roof. He had been bearing it all morning. And the general, the fool, was hanging from it with his full weight and his full contempt, trying to make it crack, not knowing, not capable of knowing, what it was built to hold. Pip's hand had found mine and gripped it hard enough to hurt. "Granddad," he whispered, and there was no laughter left anywhere in him now, no boyish certainty that fighting was the better thing. "Granddad, why doesn't he do something?" And I, who had told the boy at the start of the morning that standing still was harder than fighting, and had only half believed my own words, found that I could not answer him at all. My throat had closed. Because I was beginning, only beginning at the rail in the rain, to understand that I was watching the hardest thing I had ever seen a man do, and that I did not own the words for it, and that everything I had believed for 40 years about paint laid over ugly facts was about to be taken from me, and that I would be glad past speaking, to let it go. Vossler stood back at last, well satisfied, rocking on his heels. He had his photograph, I suppose, the great general at the foreign gate with his hand on the toy soldier's hat, a fine trophy to carry home across the eastern sea. His aides were clustering in to murmur their approval, and the two young men were busy with their cameras, and a few in the crowd, the smaller sort, had recovered enough to laugh again. And I thought, with the old bitterness rising sour in me, that this was the end of it then. The powerful man had had his sport with the man who was not allowed to answer, and now he would stroll along to his treaty and his luncheon, and the soldier would stand his cold, wet gait, and the only thing that would have happened in the whole world was that something small and mean had been done to a good man who was forbidden to stop it. That is how these things end. That is how they have always ended, in the long experience of a man who lost a brother to one of the small wars and kept the letters in a tin. The arrogant walk away dry, and the patient stand in the rain, and there is no balancing of the scale, because the scale was never a real thing, only a story we tell the children so they will go to sleep. I was wrong. I have never in my life been so grateful to be wrong about anything. Because while the general had been having his sport, things had been happening at the edges of my sight that I had been too fixed on the cruelty to notice. The first I knew of it was a change in the crowd behind us, a turning of heads, a parting murmur of the kind that runs through a packed avenue when something is coming through it that the people respect enough to make way for. And then I heard it, under the wet hush of the morning. The one sound that belongs to soldiers and to no one else on the earth, the hard, even crunch of boots that have been drilled until they fall as one boot. A file of men was coming down from the forecourt, and not at the slow ceremonial step you see in the processions, the step that is made for watching. They came at the quick march, businesslike, purposeful, the pace of men who have been sent for and are arriving. At their head walked an officer I would come to know was Colonel Mercer, who commanded the regiment, a lean gray man of perhaps 60, with a face like the worn edge of an axe, and a way of moving through a crowd that made the crowd give back before him without his having to ask it of them. Behind him came half a dozen guardsmen at the same hard pace, and behind them, 2 paces behind, carried high and slow and careful while everything else moved fast, came 2 men bearing the colors. I had come to see the colors. The whole city had come, in some part, to see the colors, the old standards of the realm brought out of the palace once a year into the light. But I had expected them to come in the procession, in their appointed hour, with the bands and the carriages and the king in his state. To see them come now, out of their hour, hurried down to a wet gate where a foreign general stood preening with his hand, still half raised from a toy soldier's hat, told every man and woman on the mile with the wit to read it that something had gone badly out of true, and that the men whose office it was to set such things right had decided to set this one right at once, in the open, in front of everyone, where the whole realm could see it done. Vossler's grin faltered and slid off his face. Whatever else he was a soldier, and a soldier knows the look and the sound of a thing being made formal. His aides drew in close around him, uncertain now, glancing at one another. The two young men lowered their cameras, no longer sure they were recording a triumph. Colonel Mercer came up to the standard gate, and he did not look at General Vossler at all, not at first, not by a hair. I thought then that it was an oversight, that the colonel had not yet noticed the general in his haste, and I understood only later that it was the very opposite of an oversight, that it was the deepest and most deliberate cut a man of his rank in his country could deliver, to walk past a foreign general as though he were a lamppost. He went first, and only to the guard. He stopped square in front of him, close, and he looked the man over slowly, from the crown of the bearskin to the wet toes of his boots, the way the general had looked him over. But where the general's look had been a buyer's look, full of contempt and searching for the flaw, the colonel's was something else entirely, something I can only call tender, the look an old man gives to a thing he has known a long time and lived in quiet fear of losing. And then Colonel Mercer did a thing that ran a cold thrill the length of my spine, a thing I have never forgot and will not forget on the day I die. He came to attention before the common guardsman, and he saluted him. A colonel of the household guard in his greatcoat, before a foreign delegation and 10,000 of the realm's people, brought his gloved hand up to the brim and held the salute, full and crisp and unhurried, to a soldier standing his sentry box. It was so far outside the order of the world, so completely backwards from the way the world arranges its great and its small, that for the space of several breaths not one person along the mile made a sound. The guard's eyes came down. At last, after all that morning, they came down off their far point and found the colonel's face and held there, and I saw the man's throat move, once, the single swallow of a long, cold hour, the first wholly human thing I had seen him do. Then the colonel turned on his heel and faced the crowd, and he had the kind of voice that does not need to be raised to carry, a hard, flat voice worn smooth and grainy like an old chisel handle that has been gripped by the same hand for 50 years, and he pitched it down the length of the mile, and it carried to the river. "This morning," he said, "a guest of this realm has seen fit to lay his hand upon a soldier of the household at his post, to strike the colors of his regiment, which is what that hat is, whatever it looked like to him, to call that soldier hollow and an ornament and a thing kept on a shelf. I have come down from the forecourt, and I have brought the colors of the realm down out of their hour, because I will not let that stand, and because I think the people gathered here have a right to know exactly what manner of ornament has been insulted at their gate, and because there are debts owed in this country that I will see paid in full, in daylight, before witnesses, no matter who is standing here to be embarrassed by the paying of them." He let that sit. The rain came down soft and steady. Not a soul moved. And only now, having said all of that to us, did Colonel Mercer turn his gray eyes at last upon General Vossler and hold them there, and the general, to whatever shred of his credit, did not look away, though I saw the color go out of his broad face by degrees as the colonel went on. 11 years ago, the colonel said, turning back to us, in the high country above the Kreslin border, where the passes go up into the snow even in summer, a company of the 8th of Foot was given an order to hold a pass. You will not have heard of the pass. There is no reason you should have. It is a cleft in the rock with a stream at the bottom of it, and a name the shepherds gave it that means nothing to anyone outside that valley. The order was a simple one and a hard one, the kind of order that is given when there is no good choice left to give. They were to hold that pass against a force that should, by every honest reckoning of numbers and ground and odds, have swept them out of it in an afternoon, and they were to go on holding it until the main column, which was strung out and slow and vulnerable on the road behind them, could get itself back across the river to safety. They were the door, you understand. They were told to be the door, and to stay shut, for as long as it took, whatever it cost, so that the others could get out behind them. The colonel paused and his jaw worked, and he went on. They held it. That is the plain fact of the matter, and it is the only part of it I will dwell on, because the men who were there have asked me, more than once, not to make a spectacle of the rest, and I will honor that even now. They held it through the first day, and they held it through the night that followed in the cold that comes down off the snowfields after dark, and they held it through the second day, by the end of which there was not a great deal of the company left to do the holding. The men who came through it gave the place a name of their own afterward, the few of them who could ever speak of it at all. They did not use the shepherd's name. They called it the Harrow Pass, because that is what it did to them. It went through them the way the harrow goes through the field in the spring, the iron teeth turning everything under, and it left nothing standing that had been standing when they marched in. I knew the name. I had not known I knew it, but I knew it. The Harrow Pass had been in the newspapers, years before, in the way that terrible far-off things are in the newspapers for a week, on the inside pages, and are then crowded out by other terrible things and forgotten. I had read of it, I suppose, over my breakfast and turned the page. I had not known one man's name from it. I had not, in any way that touched me, known that there had been men in it at all, with tins of letters and brothers and mothers, rather than just a name and a number and a line of gray type. When the column was clear at last, the colonel said, and word came back up to the pass that the others were across the river and the door could close behind them, the order came to fall back, to leave the pass and come down. But by then there was one man left at the head of it who could still stand and still carry that order out. One. He had held the right of the line, the worst of the ground and the worst of the fighting, and he had gone on holding it after the men on either side of him could no longer hold anything at all. And when the order to withdraw finally reached him, he found that there was no one left up there to pass it to. So he passed it to himself, and he obeyed it because a soldier obeys his orders, even the order to leave a place that has cost him everything. But he did not come down off that mountain light, and he did not come down empty. The colonel's voice did not break here, not quite, but it pressed down hard on the words. The way a man presses down hard on a thing to keep it from shaking. He came down carrying the colors of the 8th of foot. He had cut them from the staff with his own knife, because the staff was too long to carry through that country, and he would not, he has said, the once that he said anything, leave the colors in that place for the men who took the pass behind him to find and to keep. So he cut them down, and he wrapped them about himself under his coat. And he came down carrying a wounded man as well, across his shoulders, a corporal of his section named Adam Teal, a man with a wife and a small daughter waiting at home, a man who is alive to this hour, with gray in his own hair now, because of what was done for him on that mountain. He carried that man and those colors 9 miles down out of the high country, through the second night, alone in the cold, with no one left to spell him and no certainty that anything waited at the bottom but more of the same. And he walked into the river camp at the gristmill dawn, and he laid the colors of his regiment on the commanding officer's table without a word, and he set the corporal down by the fire and saw him taken up by the surgeons, and then he sat down in the mud at the edge of the firelight, and he did not speak again for 3 days. The colonel stopped. I became aware, distantly, that my own face was wet, and that it was not the rain doing it, and that the old woman beside me had taken hold of my sleeve without seeming to know she had done it, and that all down the rail, as far as I could see in either direction, the faces had gone the same as mine. There are decorations for what that man did on that mountain, Colonel Mercer said. This realm gave him the highest of them that it has to give. He wears it now. It is on his breast this morning with the rest, and you would have to know precisely what you were looking at to find it among them, because he has never displayed it, never let it be set apart, never in 11 years allowed it to be spoken of in his hearing. When he was well enough after to ask for anything at all, he asked for one thing only. He did not ask for honor or for ease or for a place out of the cold. He asked to be allowed to go on serving, quietly. Somewhere, he said, where the men he had left on that mountain could not watch him fail them, and so we gave him a gate to stand. This gate. We gave him the standard gate, where the very colors he cut down and carried out of the Harrow Pass are brought into the light once a year and shown to the people he and his company were the door for. He has stood this gate every founding day from that one to this. He is standing it now. He has stood it through this entire morning, through everything that was said to him and done to him at it, without moving, because that is what he came here to do, and because the men he carries with him are worth more to him than his own pride, or than the comfort of answering a fool. And here the colonel turned and looked once more at the guard, and the hard, flat, worn voice cracked at last, just slightly, just at the very end, the way a great old beam cracks once, audibly, under a load it has borne so long that you had forgotten it was bearing anything. His name, Colonel Mercer said, is Elias Wren, and there is no man living in this country or in any other who has the standing to call him an ornament. I have stood in a great many crowds in my long life. I have heard them roar at games, and I have heard them jeer at scaffolds, and I have heard them go up in that bright, glad noise they make at weddings and homecomings, and I have heard them sink to the low, ugly hum they make when they are turning into a mob. I had never, in 63 years, until that gray morning at the Standard Gate, heard a crowd of 10,000 people fall completely and perfectly silent. It is not a thing you would think a crowd could do, but we did it. Even the rain seemed to ease and hush itself to listen. We stood at the rail, all of us together, and we looked at the still scarlet figure at the gate, the man we had taken for furniture, for scenery, for the morning's handsome decoration. The ornament, the thing on the shelf, the hollow coat, and we understood, all of us at once, in the same single beat of the same enormous silence, exactly what we had been standing in front of since before the sun was up, and how small we had been to miss it. I turned and looked at General Vossler,